This is Matthew Kratter's Bitcoin University. Today I want to answer the question, will Bitcoin end all wars? Here's how to start your own war. You're first going to need some people. You're either going to need conscription or the draft, or you're going to need to make up some really cool stories about why it's a great idea for them to get their heads blown off so that you can have more wealth and power. Next, you're going to need some money to buy food and transportation and salaries and weapons for these people. Now, both of these factors have historically served as natural brakes on war, at least until the modern Fiat age. Number one, when you run out of people willing to fight on your side, the war is over. Number two, when you run out of money, the war is over. And even starting a war required a big pile of gold or silver in the old days. This meant that a king needed to be already rich, or at least really good at stealing gold from his subjects through taxes and other forms of violence in order to pay for the war. Because of these two limiting factors, people and hard money, forever wars were less feasible on a hard money standard, for example, a gold standard or other precious metal standard. This is because you can't print more gold, and it's really difficult and expensive to mine a lot of gold. Even with modern tech in the 21st century, above ground gold supplies still don't increase by more than 1 or 2% a year, so it is difficult to mine gold. You could always try to borrow the gold to pay for your war, but lenders would eventually stop lending to you once they realized how unlikely it was that you could ever accumulate enough gold to pay them back. Now contrast this with the modern age of forever wars. In the modern age of forever wars, you start a war in a distant land, you get the locals to do most of the fighting, or you use lots of remote bombers and drones, and this helps to limit the number of body bags coming home and being seen on the nightly news, which could turn the public against your war, and you don't need to draft people either, which could turn the public against your war. Now, do you raise new war taxes to fund this war? Of course not. That would be also extremely unpopular, and it might turn the public against your war. So instead, you fund this new war by issuing pieces of paper called government bonds or government paper. And if foreign or domestic investors won't buy your bonds, then you just use the ace that's in your back pocket as a modern fiat nation state. You get your central bank to print up some money to buy these bonds and put them on its own balance sheet. Success. No new war taxes needed, and now the true monetary cost of the war gets paid by everyone who holds the currency as it loses its purchasing power, and so they don't really pay attention or realize that they've just been massively taxed. If you're finding this video interesting so far, I'd pause really briefly here to ask you to help to support this channel's educational mission. Hit the subscribe button, that does really help. Leave a like, leave a comment, question, suggestion for a future video, and share this video with a friend or family member. So this is the difference between the hidden tax of inflation and the overt tax of a new war tax. If you instituted a 10% new war tax, people would say no way to your war. But 10% inflation, while the BLS lies that inflation is 2.4%, that sounds great, and it's a way of hiding the true cost of your war. And also, no one's college-age kids from your country are dying on foreign battlefields. No one's taxes are going up. And what will happen, and does happen in the modern age, is just people stop paying attention and they tune out when the war comes up on the news. How many times, for example, did you hear about bad things happening in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Sudan, etc. over the past 2 decades? You heard it on the radio or the TV or on your phone, and you just tuned out the news because it was bad and you thought it didn't really affect you. But if the U.S. had sent lots of American soldiers, for example, to Ukraine and had instituted a special war tax on every single American resident and citizen, how many people do you think would be driving around with "I stand with Ukraine" bumper stickers on their cars when they had to send 10 or 20% of their annual salary to the government and send a couple of their children to Ukraine as well? Also, likewise, if Trump had just announced a special 15% tax to pay for his upcoming planned war in Iran, how many more people do you think would be publicly speaking out against the folly of fighting yet another war of Netanyahu's? Here's the sad truth. Fiat money hides the true monetary cost of war. If we take a look, for example, the war on terror of the past 20 years cost approximately $8 trillion. That's more than 20% of the current U.S. national debt, which is at $37 trillion. Cost of the wars, $8 trillion. And if we take a look at how this has been paid for, we could look at the Fed's balance sheet where they basically printed up fresh U.S. dollars to buy U.S. government debt and to a lesser extent mortgage-backed securities, but this is mostly U.S. government debt. And we can see back in the early 2000s, this was below $1 trillion. And then it really began to balloon at the time of the great financial crisis when the U.S. government bailed out the banks so that all the bankers get their bonuses while Americans lost their homes. So this was in part to recapitalize the bank and to sort of re-stimulate everything after the great financial crisis. But another way of looking at this chart is that this was the Fed funding the war on terror. Current balance sheet of the Fed is approximately $7 trillion, so very close to the war, the true cost and the multi-decade cost of the war on terror. If we hadn't fought the Sully War in Iraq and in Afghanistan and these other countries, we would not have this much debt, and perhaps the quantitative easing that the Fed has been forced to do would never have happened. So war does have a cost. It is borne by people, even people who don't die on the battlefield or have their taxes raised. It does show up in the form of decreased purchasing power. And fiat money makes it really easy to fund wars. By contrast, hard money, money that cannot be easily printed up for free like fiat money can, hard money like gold or Bitcoin, makes it much more difficult and more costly to fight wars. If the U.S. government, for example, had to extract Bitcoin from every family before starting a war, we wouldn't be all just sitting around waiting to hear if Trump has decided to blow yet another few $1 trillion on yet another foreign war misadventure. Instead, we'd be all out with our pitchforks saying, absolutely not, I'm not giving up my Bitcoin so that we can help Israel with Iran. And you can't take someone's Bitcoin without going door to door and putting a gun to their head. You can't just freeze their bank or brokerage account, as has been done in the past and has been done in economies that are at war. Bitcoin is very difficult to seize. It's confiscation resistant. And this is quite different from fiat, where all you need to do is steal the money out of people's bank accounts or have the U.S. Treasury print up some extra paper and have Jerome Powell print up some extra U.S. dollars to buy that paper. The economic story behind the bloody wars of the 20th century is all about abandoning a hard money standard in order to fund global war. And this is one reason that World War I and World War II were so terrible. While the world was still mainly on a gold standard, it was beginning to erode, as we see here from this passage from Safe writes here in this post. Fiat money basically came into existence to cover up the fact that the British people had the good sense to not buy their government's World War I bonds. Here's a passage from his book, The Fiat Standard, which I'd encourage you to read. The passage goes like this. In November 1914, the British government issued the first war bond, aiming to raise £350 million from private investors at an interest rate of 4.1% and a maturity of 10 years. Surprisingly, the bond was undersubscribed, or not surprisingly, because people don't want war, and the British public purchased less than a third of the targeted sum. To avoid publicizing this failure, the Bank of England, namely the central bank there, granted funds to its chief cashier and his deputy to purchase the bonds under their own names. The Financial Times, ever the bank's faithful mouthpiece, published an article proclaiming the loan was oversubscribed, in other words, lied to the people of the UK. John Maynard Keynes worked at the Treasury at the time, and in a secret memo to the bank, he praised them for what he called their masterly manipulation. Keynes' fondness for surreptitious monetary arrangements would go on to inspire thousands of economic textbooks published worldwide. The Bank of England had set the tone for a century of central bank and government collusion behind the public's back, and this was used chiefly to finance wars. And it was really World War I that led to the UK and the British pound really no longer being fully backed by precious metals. So I think in conclusion, a Bitcoin standard, just like the gold standard, but the gold standard failed and led to fiat, so we don't want to try gold again. But I think a Bitcoin standard wouldn't put an end to all wars, but it would certainly slow down the global war machine, in particular the American global war machine, which is the big problem, by making it much more difficult and expensive for leaders worldwide to fight wars without not just the consent of the people, but also the full buy-in of the people and their pocketbooks. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the subscribe and like buttons. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.